Oh, it's good to be with you up here once again. Thank you for inviting me to speak this morning in Dwayne's absence. I always find great joy in being able to preach with the people I love, all God's children. This morning we read the gospel about Thomas, and he's gotten a rather awkward name, Doubting Thomas. I named my son Thomas, and Thomas actually means seeker of the truth, one who constantly looks for and wants to know the truth about life in general. And so today, rather than talk about Thomas, I want to talk about our own doubts and our own fears. And in it, I want to talk about an individual whom I have had the privilege to serve in hospice ministry. I'll call her Gloria. As I said, she was a patient of mine. The story I'm about to tell you, I was given permission by Gloria to share. Gloria was a hospice patient who loved strawberries. She had 2 bowls over the bed tables, the type you find in a hospital setting. On either side of her recliner was one of these tables. They were covered with catalogs and magazines, get well cards from friends who no longer came to visit her, her cell phone and television remote, notepad and pen, lip balm and tissues, bottle of water, books of crossword puzzles, and a crocheting project that I never once saw her pick up or ever make progress on. All the things she might need at any given time. She would swing one table in front and over her legs and the other out of the way with a practiced hand. Today when I visited her, the table in front of her had a large bowl of strawberries and a much smaller bowl of strawberry stems. She was gleeful about those strawberries. She ate each one in a single huge bite, emptying the bowl and filling the other with remarkable speed. "These always make me feel like I'm a little girl again," she would quip, "out in the sunshine." "Did you grow up on the farm?" I asked. "Oh, no. I spent a lot of time on the farm when I was a child." "Tell me more," I said. The conversation meandered somewhere else, but in a few minutes she grew quiet and pensive. She picked up another strawberry and examined it very slowly. She closed her eyes. "I want to tell you a story," she said. Every Sunday after church, we all came home. We put on our work clothes. My grandmother, she would come and pick us up in her big car, and we would drive out into the country to a farm. It was a farm of a black family. Not a very big farm, kind of falling apart because there was no farmer. He was dead. It was just his wife out there trying to make a living, trying to hold on. We'd go out there and we would work hard. Even my grandmother. We were out in the fields picking strawberries, helping with the harvesting, pulling those strawberries. But I didn't mind. I actually liked it. Because there were a half dozen or so other children who were there also to play with us. After picking the strawberries, we would go to the creek and we'd play. We'd go hide and seek. We built forts and played jokes on each other. We had so much fun together. We laughed a lot. I loved going out there. But I never knew who they were or why we went out every week. We never visited any other farms or any other black families, just this one. When I asked why we went out there, I was always told to hush. When I became a teen, I asked again, and my mother sternly told me never to ask that question again. When I grew up and got married and had my own children, I stopped going out there, and then I sort of forgot and didn't think about them again. I didn't even think I knew their last name. Years went by, and my grandmother died. And at her funeral, a black woman came up to me and threw her arms around me and asked if I recognized her. I was totally confused, Gloria said. No, I don't think so. I'm Betty from the farm, remember, on Sundays? I hadn't seen her since I was a teenager, but I knew her and I suddenly remembered. Yes, of course, I said. Of course. I'm your cousin, she said. Gloria continued, my mouth must have dropped to the floor. That entire family were my cousins. My own flesh and blood. My father's brother had fallen in love with a black woman. They lived together in secret out in the country and had children. But then he died, leaving them alone out there, one woman with 5 children to run a farm. That's why we went out there every Sunday, because she couldn't do it alone. They were my cousins, my father's nieces and nephews, my grandmother's grandchildren. Gloria sat back in her recliner, threw her arms up and laughed. All along, Steve, they were my cousins. And you had no idea, I asked. No, it was one big secret. But Betty knew, I asked. Oh, Betty knew all her life. They knew who they were and who they belonged to. But they were sworn to secrecy not to tell anyone until after my grandmother's death. Why would that be, I asked. Because of fear and shame. They had to keep their secret on who they really were. Gloria started to laugh again. You don't really understand, do you? Understand what, I asked. Back in the early 30s, this sort of thing just didn't happen. At least not publicly. When my uncle fell in love with a black woman, he broke every social taboo of the time. There was great fear in breaking what was the norm. There was great shame in not following the rules. Times were different then. We had so many secrets in our family. We all know about secrets, don't we? There are a lot of secrets that have been entrusted to me by patients and families over the years. Most of them are personal secrets about the teller, secrets about things that they did, things they thought or felt or wished, things that they thought that they could never tell me, things that happened to them, things that were done to them when they were small or helpless or desperate, secrets about self. But some of the secrets I've been privy to were elaborate, family-held secrets. Secrets with multiple participants and levels of understanding. Secrets held across generations that demanded that children be complicit in their own fear and shame, like Gloria's cousins. Because that's what secrets are all about. Fear and shame. Shame along with the fear or belief that we are so monstrous, we are so terrible, so inhuman, so different, so weird, so queer, it must not be known. Never. The intense humiliation and pain of being shamed or fearful of a perceived transgression just reinforces the need to keep the secret. That's why closets remain. That's why we self-medicate. That's why you fill in the blank. Secrets are only told when they are told at all, with bodies trembling and voices shaking so hard they are barely comprehensible. With fear and urgency in equal measure, throbbing with the enormous energy it has taken to keep them secret for so long. Why did I keep my secret of being a gay man away from my family, my friends, for so long? I'll tell you why. Shame and fear. I was afraid. I was afraid I would be looked upon as that faggot they called me in 9th grade. So I made sure I dated women, or girls back then. I got married. I had 2 children. No one would call me that again, right? Then I became a pastor. I was fearful I would lose my job as a pastor. But every time I preached, every single time I preached, I felt like a phony. Here I was telling people about God's love and God's grace when I was questioning whether God really loved me just as I was. I was shamed into believing gay people were inferior, subhuman, so different from the rest of society. I remember the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah told in Sunday school. I remember hearing the words unnatural or deviant being used in my church. At the very core of who I was, it meant that I was failing as what I was being taught that God wanted me to be. I felt I was cursed. The corollary of all that shame I learned the hard way was to not tell people who I really was. But the problems with secrets is that they are exhausting, aren't they? And while they may protect what people want to believe about you, it comes at an enormous cost. I have another story to tell you, Gloria said to me just 2 weeks ago. She had steadily gotten weaker so that we were no longer visiting in her living room, but we were now visiting in her bedroom. She bit her lips hard. There's a story I want to tell you that I've told no one, but I want you to tell it at my funeral, she said. When I got pregnant, I was only 19 years old and I was not married. Unlike other times, she did not laugh as she told me this story. She didn't really seem to be telling it to me. She spoke slowly and laboriously and paused after each sentence with a look of slight shock in her face, as though surprised by what she was telling me. She almost seemed to be in a trance, but she didn't hesitate. She told it as if compelled, as if once she had begun, she could not stop. I wasn't married. The daddy was my best friend's boyfriend. They had broken up. He asked me to go for a drive. I'd never had a boyfriend. I was flattered. I never had sex before, and I didn't know what was happening. It was very confusing. I was foolish. I was so foolish, she said. Later, by the time I figured out I was pregnant, he and my best friend had gotten back together again, and they were now engaged. My friend was so happy I couldn't tell her what was happening. I worked as a secretary, and I still lived with my parents in their home, and I never knew anything about sex. I know it seems crazy, I know, but I didn't. When I told my father, oh God, my father, I called up my father, came home. He was so strict. He was the strictest father in the world. We weren't even allowed to wear skirts above our knee or a smudge of lipstick on our face. I wasn't allowed to wear my hair down except in a ponytail. And then I got pregnant. To get pregnant, oh my Lord, I thought my dad would kill me. But instead, he sent me away to a home for unwed mothers. He and my mother both. She agreed to it, my mother. They said it was the only way I had to go because I had nowhere else to live, no one to marry, not enough money to raise a baby. And once anyone found out I was pregnant, I'd lose my job anyway. I'd be the shame of my family. I was so afraid. So what choice did I have? Things were different back then, Steve. Women like me were called tramps. And I felt like garbage. But I didn't want to be garbage. I didn't want that. So I agreed to go away. 6 months later, I had the baby. Some of the people there said I shouldn't look at him because it would make it harder to give him up, because that's what I was convinced to do. That's what I was told to do. I came back to my father's and mother's home a few days after the baby's birth. When they picked me up, they never said a word. They never asked about the baby. They didn't give me any addresses of the girls that I had lived with for over 6 months. It was like it had never happened. I gave him up and never even got to hold him or see what he looked like. But the next day, the very next day, I knew I'd made a mistake. I woke up and I couldn't breathe. With every drop of my soul, I knew I made a mistake. I was like a caged animal, she said. I couldn't stop moving. I had made a terrible mistake. I had to get my baby back. So I called up the home and I talked to the social worker. She was a Jewish woman originally from New York. Her name was Ruth. So she was so skinny, I couldn't even believe she could stand up straight. But she was the most intimidating woman you'd ever want to meet. Ruth said I could not have the baby back. I told her I had to have him back. She told me it was better for the baby and better for the family. I said I had to get him back. She said he would be better off without me on account that I had no money and I had no husband. I just kept telling her I had to get my baby back. Finally, she said that if I wanted the baby back, I had to pay for him. Yes, pay for him. I had to buy him back. I had to pay back all the money they spent on me. I had to pay back 6 months of room and board. I had to pay back all the costs for the doctor visits and for delivering the baby in the hospital, for the formula that they were giving him, for the nurses that had taken care of him. She was sorry, but those were the rules. If I can do that, I asked, if I can do that, pay back all the money, can I have him back? Can I have my baby back? Yes, Ruth said. But you're making a mistake. A terrible mistake. And it would be the worst thing for that baby and for you. You have no husband, no home. You don't even have enough money to buy shoes for the baby or clothes or food. You know what, Steve? She said, I sold everything I had to raise that money. I sold my car. I sold my record player. I sold all my records. I sold all my clothes except for one dress and one pair of shoes. I sold every gift that anyone had ever given me, every bit of jewelry. I sold even my curlers. I used every penny of my savings until I finally had enough money. When I told my parents I was going back to get my baby, fear engulfed their stares at me. I thought my father was going to have a stroke right there in the living room. I have never seen anyone that afraid or that angry. So much so, I became scared. I thought I might turn to dust from fear, but I knew I had to do this. They kicked me out of the house. I went to my best friend for help. She was now married to my baby's daddy. I don't know if he knew he was the daddy, but he looked right at me with a look of fear in his face. He said, no. No way are you living with us. So finally I went to my grandmother. She lived in the country. I told her what happened. I was afraid that she was going to reject me, but instead she said she would help. You and your baby can live here with me. She drove me to the unwed mother's home, took all afternoon to drive the distance. When we arrived, Ruth, the social worker from New York, met us in her office. She asked me if I really wanted to do this. I just pushed the envelope of money in front of her. She looked at me real hard. She never smiled. I didn't smile back. But I noticed her face wasn't as stiff, softer maybe, I thought. Ruth called a nurse to bring the baby in. He was already a month old at that point. It was the first time I'd ever seen him. Ruth took the baby and walked over to where I was sitting, stuck in the chair like a statue. She put the baby in my arms. "You are his mother," she said. "I've never met a woman who is more of a mother than you. Don't let anyone take him away from you again. If you love him this much all your life, he will turn out to be fine." Gloria became out of breath from the exertion of telling me. She snapped out of her trance as I did. She turned to look at me. Her face looked different. She pinned me with her eyes, drained but fierce. "I want you to speak at my funeral," she said. "I want everyone to know this story. Not everyone does. Steve, I loved, and in the end, love paid off. I was afraid, but in the end, I found courage, and I did the right thing. I was shamed by my mother and my father and by my baby's daddy, but came to believe what they thought wasn't what made me who I was. I am, and always will be, my son's mother. There is no shame in that," she said. Gloria closed her eyes for a moment. I thought she might have been so worn out she had fallen asleep, but then she continued. "It's amazing that you can love someone so much when you've never met him. I loved my son so much and didn't even know him. How is that possible? How is it possible to love something so much that you're willing to give up your whole life for that individual, and you don't even know him yet? I loved him before I even knew him," she said. "Keeping secrets is like fertilizing a weed," Gloria said. "Secrets that fertilize shame or fear in any of us choke out the love even before it can grow." She cried, and then she began to laugh. She cried again, then she began to laugh, as she always did, and she couldn't speak any longer. That was the last time I saw Gloria. Gloria died on Easter Sunday. I held the funeral just on Friday. I told the story as she requested. I knew I had to. But I also knew that I had to share her story with you this morning, the people I love so much. Not because you know Gloria or ever will know who she is, because in it there is an Easter message to be learned and believed, simple truths. Scripture tells us that God loved you. Personalize it. God loved you even before you were born. Easter reminds us that God loved you. Personalize it. Loved you so much. He was willing to die on that cross and come out of that tomb to tell you, you have nothing to fear. The disciples, they were huddled in fear. They were filled with shame, what they hadn't done to protect Jesus. One of them had denied Jesus. Another had doubted. Another had betrayed Jesus. And yet Jesus comes to them as Jesus comes to you this morning, in your doubts, in your fears, and says, "Peace be with you." I know what you did last night, Jesus says. I know the shame you hold. I know those fears that you have. Peace be with you. And Jesus continues to remind them, as he does us this morning, again and again and again and again, I am with you. You are loved. I love you so much that if you were the only person ever created in the history of the world, I would have died on that cross for you and would have come out of that grave to remind you you have nothing to fear. No need to be afraid. If I have overcome death itself, there is nothing more powerful. You have nothing to fear. There is nothing to be afraid of. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again and again and again and again. There is no other verse spoken throughout the Bible or quoted as often in every single book of Scripture as fear not. Be not afraid. 365 times to be exact. One for every day of the year. What do you think our God is trying to tell us? And when you know you're loved, I mean you really believe this, and you no longer have doubt, you discover what Gloria did. Love does shatter fear, and it destroys shame, because we know who we are and to whom we belong, which in the end brings us a peace that passes all human understanding. Amen.